Okay, let's unpack a real curveball today. The story we usually hear about moving from monarchy to democracy.
Right, the one that says it's all straightforward progress.
Yeah,
More freedom, more representation.
exactly. But what if, that's not the whole picture? We're doing a deep dive into a perspective that kind of flips that narrative completely.
It definitely challenges some very basic assumptions we tend to hold about political systems.
Totally. We're looking at ideas from Hans-Hermann Hoppe, mostly from his book Democracy, The God That Failed. And just a heads up, this isn't your typical history lesson.
No, it's quite provocative. Hoppe gives a very contrarian view on monarchy, democracy, and also this idea he calls natural order.
Yeah, so the sources we're digging into really explore the, let's say, economic and social gears of these different government types.
Using historical examples, but also theoretical arguments. We'll touch on how power changes, the role of public opinion, redistribution, centralization versus, say, secession.
And this core idea of a natural order based on private property.
That's right.
So for you, the learner, our mission here is really to pull out the essence of Hoppe's arguments. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding his views, which get debated a lot, without you having to wade through all the dense academic stuff.
And it's worth stressing, even if you disagree with where he ends up, and many people do, understanding how he gets there gives you a really valuable different angle on history and politics.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. His big starting point is how he defines the state.
Yeah, this is crucial. He defines the state as basically an agency that has a compulsory monopoly and a territory over two things: ultimate decision-making, so the final say in conflicts, and taxation.
A monopoly on judging and taxing, essentially.
Got it. Keep that definition in mind. It's foundational for everything else.
Okay. So based on that, he draws this sharp line between monarchy and democracy based on ownership.
Exactly. Monarchy, he says, is like private ownership of government. The king owns the kingdom, more or less.
Like personal property.
Right. Whereas democracy is public ownership.
Yeah.
The government theoretically belongs to the people.
Okay, so what difference does that make in practice? Let's start with monarchy private ownership.
Well, the big implication, according to Hoppe, is incentives. If a monarch owns the territory, they have a personal, vested interest in its long-term value.
Like a landlord wants to keep their property valuable.
Precisely. They want it to be productive not just now, but for their kids, their grandkids. So they're incentivized to, well, not exploit it too much. You don't want to kill the golden goose, right?
Makes sense. Preserve the asset for future income. He also mentioned something about a clearer class distinction.
Yeah, the idea is that under monarchy, it's pretty obvious who the rulers are and who the ruled are. It's a distinct class.
And that matters because...
Because, Hoppe suggests, this clarity can actually make it easier for the ruled population to recognize and potentially resist increases in exploitation. They know who's taking their money.
Okay. Not blurred lines like maybe in democracy.
Right. And he brings in Bertrand de Jouvenel here, who noted that monarchs often operated within existing private law traditions. They didn't just make up rules arbitrarily.
They sort of inherited a legal framework.
Yes. And there was often this sense that the king had a duty to uphold justice, to respect existing property rights.
He uses that Frederick the Great story, right? The Miller of Sanssouci.
Exactly. As an example, maybe anecdotal, but illustrating the idea that even a powerful king felt bound by established property rights, a kind of perceived solidarity of rights.
Okay, so that's the private ownership side. Now let's flip the coin. Public ownership, democracy.
Here, Hoppe argues, the leaders are temporary caretakers. They don't own the country, they're just managing it for a term.
Like renting a car versus owning it, maybe?
That's a good analogy. The incentive structure shifts. The time horizon becomes much shorter.
How so?
Well, Democratic leaders need to win the next election. Their focus tends to be on delivering benefits now to satisfy current voters, rather than necessarily preserving the long-term capital stock of the nation.
So more focus on immediate results, less on, say, the national debt 50 years from now.
That's the argument. Maximize current income and power during your limited time in office, with less regard for the long-term consequences on the nation's overall wealth.
And what about that blurring of lines between rulers and ruled?
In theory, in a democracy, we are the government. Everyone's a part owner. Hoppe argues this can actually weaken resistance to government growth.
How? Seems counterintuitive.
Because if you feel like you're part of the ruling apparatus, you might be less inclined to object when your government expands its power or spending. It's psychologically different from resisting a king you see as separate.
Interesting. Okay, this links directly to his idea about time preference, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Time preference is basically how much you value present goods compared to future goods. Do you want $100 now or $110 next year?
Right. Low time preference means you're more future-oriented, willing to wait for a bigger payoff. High means you want stuff now.
Exactly. So Hoppe argues private government monarchy encourages lower time preference. The owner king thinks long-term, invests, saves, plans for the future value of his asset.
Thinking generations ahead.
Right. But public government democracy tends to raise time preference. The temporary caretakers and the voting public are more focused on present benefits.
So more consumption, maybe more debt, less long-term investment?
That's the tendency he identifies, and he connects this to what he calls the process of civilization. He sees civilization as partly defined by a falling time preference society becoming more future-oriented, leading to more saving, investment, progress.
And the flip side?
Decivilization involves a rising time preference. His really provocative claim is that the historical shift from monarchy to democracy actually strengthened these decivilizing forces by systematically raising society's time preference.
Wow. Okay, so he's basically saying democracy might inadvertently push us towards being more short-sighted. That's a heavy claim. How does he back this up historically?
Well, this is where he starts looking at trends in things like government spending, taxation, money, debt, law, trying to connect them to this theoretical framework.
Okay, let's look at exploitation first, taxes and spending.
He acknowledges taxes went up, even under monarchs sometimes, especially for wars. But he cites the economic historian Carlo Cipolla.
What did Cipolla find?
Cipolla estimated that even in the late monarchical period, the public sector probably only took about 5 to 8% of national income.
5 to 8%? That's tiny compared to now.
It really is. Hoppe contrasts that sharply with the democratic era. By the mid-1970s, in many Western democracies, government revenue was hitting around 50% of national income. A huge jump.
50%? Wow. What about government jobs?
Similar trend. Under monarchy, government employment was apparently quite low, maybe rarely over 3% of the workforce until the late 1800s.
Okay.
But by the mid-70s in the democratic era, it was often around 15% in those same Western countries.
So by those measures, taxes, spending, employment, just got vastly bigger and more resource-consuming under democracy.
That's the picture he paints using that data, yes.
Okay, what about money? Inflation.
His argument here revolves around the type of money used. Under monarchy, it was mostly commodity money, gold, silver.
Stuff with intrinsic value, not just government say-so.
Right, and largely outside direct government control. The result, he argues, was generally stable or even falling prices over the long run. Your money bought more over time, except maybe during big wars or gold rushes.
Sounds nice.
Contrast that with the Democratic Republican age. Governments shifted to fiat money, paper money they control.
Okay.
And since then, Hoppe points out, there's been a persistent secular trend towards inflation. Currency values erode. He gives examples like the U.S. wholesale price index skyrocketing after leaving the gold standard.
So the argument is commodity money under kings meant more stability. Government paper money under democracy means inflation.
In essence, yes. Tying money to something physical versus letting politicians manage it.
Got it. What about debt? Governments always seem to be in debt.
True, but Hoppe notes a difference in patterns. Monarchs borrowed, often heavily for wars, yes. But sometimes, in peacetime, that debt was actually paid down.
Like the British debt after Napoleon.
Exactly. Use that example. There were periods where it significantly decreased.
And under democracy.
He contrasts this with the trend in, say, British debt in the more democratic 20th century, where it just kept rising in wartime and peacetime. A relentless upward climb.
Seems familiar. Okay, the next point is about law. This sounds fundamental.
It really is. Hoppe argues that monarchs primarily saw their role as enforcing existing private law, particularly property rights. It was law that largely predated the state.
Okay, upholding the existing rules of the game.
More or less. But with democracy and the idea of public ownership, a new kind of law emerges. Public law.
Public law, meaning...
Law that governs the state's own operations and its relationship with citizens. Crucially, this public law often creates exceptions for government agents, things they can do that private citizens can't. And it regulates public property differently from private property.
So one set of rules for the government, another for everyone else.
That's the implication. And Hoppe, again citing Juvenal, argues that this public law gradually expands, overshadows, and even displaces traditional private law. a situation where individual rights, especially property rights, are seen less as fundamental and pre-existing and more as things granted by the legislature, things that can be changed or taken away by a majority vote.
So your rights become more precarious, dependent on political decisions.
That's the core argument, a very fundamental shift in how law and rights are understood.
Okay, wow. Let's shift to warfare. How does the type of government affect how wars are fought?
Hoppe contrasts monarchical wars with democratic wars quite sharply. He argues that under kings, wars were often limited affairs, maybe dynastic or territorial disputes.
Fought between professional armies?
Largely, yes. He uses Ferrero's description of 18th century war as almost like a single combat between two armies. The impact on the general civilian population was often, though not always, relatively contained. There were certain rules, customs.
Okay, a more limited professional kind of conflict.
Compared to what came later, yes. The democratic age, he argues, ushered in the era of ideological wars.
Wars fought over ideas, not just territory.
Exactly. Fueled by nationalism, by the desire to spread or defend a political philosophy like democracy itself. He cites military thinkers like Howard and Foch on this shift to national wars, involving entire populations, total mobilization.
And World War I is a key example for him here, President Wilson.
Absolutely. Wilson's framing of the war as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Hoppe highlights work by Kunalt Ledin discussing Wilson's intense ideological opposition to monarchies like Austria-Hungary.
Seeing them as illegitimate simply because they weren't democracies.
Pretty much. Hoppe also brings up Immanuel Kant, who famously predicted that universal republicanism, a form of democracy, would lead to perpetual peace.
And Hoppe's point is?
Well, look at the 20th and 21st centuries. Democracies proliferated, but did we get perpetual peace? He argues history suggests otherwise. The nature of war just changed, becoming potentially more total and ideological.
So the democratic peace theory doesn't quite match reality in his view. Okay, let's talk about something closer to home for most people. Redistribution of wealth.
Right. Hoppe connects democracy directly to increased redistribution. He uses the concept of the tragedy of the commons.
How does that apply here? The tragedy of the commons is usually about, like, overfishing or something.
He applies it to property and political power. In a one-person, one-vote system with open entry into politics, everyone theoretically has a claim on the public resources and the power to influence how they're distributed.
Okay.
The incentive, he argues, is for majorities, particularly those with less wealth, the have-nots, to use their voting power to legislate transfers of wealth away from minorities who have more wealth, the haves.
So democracy inherently encourages taking from Peter to pay Paul because Paul has more votes.
That's the core mechanism he identifies. Though he adds, it's not always strictly rich to poor. Different coalitions can form to redistribute wealth in various ways. But the underlying incentive is there.
And he links this strongly to expanding the vote. Universal suffrage.
Yes. He sees the move toward universal adult suffrage as the key political change that unlocked this large-scale redistributive potential within democratic systems.
Okay, so a built-in tendency towards redistribution driven by voting incentives. Now, what about bigger versus smaller government units? Centralization and secession.
Hoppe has a, let's say, positive view of secession, or at least its potential. He argues that while secession initially might just shift control over nationalized assets from one government to another.
It's just changing the management.
At first, yes, but it can have deeper positive effects. Secession often happens because a region feels exploited by the central government. Think of Slovenia leaving Yugoslavia or the Baltic states leaving the Soviet Union.
They felt they were paying in more than they were getting out, or being culturally suppressed.
Exactly. So by seceding, they replace that forced, potentially exploitative internal relationship with what becomes a voluntary external relationship, trade, diplomacy.
Moving from forced integration to voluntary separation.
Right. And Hoppe argues forced integration breeds conflict, while voluntary separation tends towards peace and cooperation. He speculates that widespread secession could even lead to a world of many small liberal states.
Like lots of Monacos or Hong Kongs.
Kind of. Small units, focused on facilitating trade, perhaps using commodity money again, competing for citizens and capital. He sees this decentralization as potentially very prosperous and culturally dynamic.
And he connects this to Mises.
Yes. He points out that Ludwig von Mises saw the right of self-determination, essentially, secession as fundamental to the concept of democracy itself. If a group doesn't want to be part of a state, democracy implies they should have the right to leave.
Interesting. Okay, let's tackle immigration, another hot topic. How does the monarchy versus democracy lens apply here?
Again, it comes back to ownership and incentives. A monarch, as the private owner of the country's territory and capital value, would likely view immigration through the lens of preserving or enhancing that value.
Like managing an estate.
Exactly. They might want to restrict immigrants who seem likely to drain resources or cause social disruption, unproductive or destructive subjects, and selectively encourage those likely to contribute positively skilled workers, entrepreneurs.
Protecting the asset value. He mentioned Britain restricting emigration of skilled workers.
Yes, as an example of that kind of thinking, keeping valuable human capital within the realm.
Okay, so that's the monarch's perspective. How does democracy handle it differently?
Democratic leaders, being temporary caretakers without ownership, have different incentives. Policy tends to be driven more by short-term political calculations, current income considerations, and often egalitarian ideology.
Egalitarianism meaning?
The idea that everyone should be treated the same, which often translates into pressure for non-discriminatory immigration policies. Less selection based on perceived productivity or integration potential.
So potentially less focus on the long-term economic or social impact.
That's the argument. Hoppe also points to non-discrimination laws within democracies, like civil rights legislation, and suggests they often coincide with moves towards more open, non-discriminatory immigration, leading to what he terms forced integration.
Forced integration meaning people have to accept immigrants into their communities or businesses whether they want to or not.
That seems to be the implication, tied to the erosion of private property rights regarding association. He also notes that welfare states and democracies can create an additional incentive attracting immigrants who primarily seek access to benefits, potentially straining public finances.
Okay, so fundamentally different incentives shaping immigration policy. This leads to his point about free trade and immigration, which sounds quite pointed.
Yes, he argues there's a contradiction in supporting both totally free trade and totally free immigration from a private property perspective.
Why? They sound similar freedom of movement.
Because, he argues, free trade involves the movement of goods based on mutual consent between a willing seller and a willing buyer, or sender and receiver.
Okay, voluntary exchange.
Right. But free immigration involves the movement of people. And under a free immigration policy, people might move into a territory without necessarily having been invited by any specific property owner within that territory.
They might just show up in public spaces.
Exactly. Hoppe controversially calls this movement of uninvited people onto territory, even public territory ultimately derived from private property, a form of invasion.
Wow, invasion is strong language.
It is. His argument is that a core function of government is protecting property. And if property rights are taken seriously, that should include the right of owners to control who enters their property. Therefore, immigration should ideally be by invitation only.
And he brings in Rothbard's idea here.
Yes, Murray Rothbard's concept of a fully privatized country and an anarcho-capitalist society where all land is privately owned. In such a society, entry would only be possible if invited by a property owner. Hoppe sees this as the logical conclusion of consistent private property rights applied to immigration.
So no automatic right to enter, only a right to be invited by someone who owns property there.
That's the idea he puts forward as being consistent with the private property order.
Okay. Finally, let's just touch on this natural order concept that seems to be the backdrop for his critique.
The natural order is Hoppe's term for a theoretical society based purely on private property and voluntary exchange. All land and resources are privately owned.
No state.
Essentially, yes. Services like security, justice, defense would be provided competitively by private agencies, funded voluntarily by customers. It's a form of theoretical anarcho-capitalism.
And why bring this up?
He uses it as a benchmark. He argues that when you compare both monarchy and democracy to this theoretical natural order, you can see the flaws and statist assumptions in both systems more clearly.
So from this natural order perspective,
the transition from monarchy to democracy isn't necessarily progress towards freedom. In some ways, particularly regarding property rights and time preference, he argues it might even be seen as a step away from the principles of a natural private property order, a kind of civilizational decline from that specific viewpoint.
Okay, that's a lot to absorb. Let's try and wrap this up. We've definitely covered some challenging ground.
Yeah, just recapping some of the really standout points. Hoppe's view that democracy has inherent downsides related to short-term thinking and redistribution.
His economic arguments comparing the incentives under private versus public government ownership, especially regarding time preference.
And his different takes on things we often don't connect to government structure, like the nature of war, the evolution of law, and immigration policies. It's definitely a paradigm shift for many.
Absolutely. And for you, the learner, we know these are complex ideas, maybe even unsettling ones. But hopefully, engaging with them, even if you disagree, sparks some insights, those aha moments.
The goal wasn't to convince you of Hoppe's views, but to give you a clear handle on his arguments, his framework.
Right. We wanted to offer that concise overview without you feeling totally bogged down.
Because thinking through these alternative perspectives, really wrestling with them, helps clarify our own assumptions about how government works, or how it should work.
Definitely. So here's a final thought to maybe chew on after this deep dive. Given these arguments about ownership and incentives, how much does the basic structure of government, monarchy, democracy, something else, actually dictate the long-term path of a society? Maybe even more than the specific policies passed day to day.
Or, put another way, Hoppe argues government legitimacy rests on public opinion. If that's true, what are the really fundamental ideas about the state, about rights, about property that we, the public, need to be examining most closely right now? What should we accept and what should we maybe reject?
Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.